On April 22, 2016, residents of Pike County, Ohio, awoke to the kind of horror that seemed impossible in their quiet, rural community. 8 members of the same family, the Rhodens, were found brutally executed in 4 different homes. The killings were precise, calculated, and chilling in their detail. Each victim shot in the head, most as they slept. The massacre shocked not only the small Appalachian county, but also the nation, launching what would become the largest criminal investigation in Ohio's history. To understand how the crime could unfold, we need to begin with the Rhoden family itself, who they were, how they lived, and the close-knit but complicated dynamics that tied them together. Pike County, Ohio, a rural setting. Pike County lies in the Appalachian foothills of southern Ohio, about 80 miles south of Columbus and an hour from the Kentucky border. It is a rural, economically struggling region where rolling hills and wooded hollows give way to small towns and clusters of mobile homes. The county's population hovers around 28,000, spread thinly across farmland and 2-lane country roads. Life in Pike County is shaped by its isolation. Jobs are scarce, and many residents rely on trades, farming, or small businesses to get by. Families often live near one another, sometimes on the same roads, or even the same pieces of land passed down for generations. Neighbors know one another well, but privacy is also fiercely guarded. It was in this environment that the Rhoden family lived. Tight-knit, hardworking, and in many ways, emblematic of Pike County's way of life. The Rhoden family, the Rhodens, were well known in the area, both respected and sometimes controversial. At the head of the family was Christopher Rhoden Sr., a 40-year-old father of 3 grown children. Frankie, Hannah, and Chris Ginger. Chris Sr. was a big man with a larger-than-life presence, known for working hard, helping his children, and keeping his extended family close. His family spread across several homes along Union Hill Road and a nearby property in Piketon. The Rhodens often gathered, worked together, and lived in close proximity. They were protective of one another, which made the events of April 2016 even more shocking. The victims in this case were Christopher Rhoden Sr., the patriarch of the family; Dana Rhoden, 37, his ex-wife, mother of his children, still very close to the family; Clarence Frankie Rhoden, 20, the eldest son of Chris and Dana; Hannah Rhoden, 19, their daughter, a young mother; Christopher Rhoden Jr., 65, their youngest son; Hannah Gilly de Tenantanard, Frankie's fiancée, mother of their baby; Kenneth Rhoden, a 4/4 Chris Sr's brother; Gary Rhoden, 38, Chris Sr's cousin. The family included young parents, teenagers, and adults in their prime. Many of them had children of their own, several of whom were present in the homes when the murders occurred. Incredibly, 3 young children were found alive and unharmed amid the carnage, spared by the killers for reasons that would later come into focus. Life on Union Hill Road. The Rhodens' homes were modest, mostly trailers and small houses set back from Union Hill Road, a quiet, 2-lane road that wound through the woods of Pike County. These weren't random locations. The killers knew where to go and who would be inside. Chris Sr. lived with his cousin Gary at one property, while Dana lived separately with their daughter Hannah and son Chris Jr. Frankie and his fiancée, Hannah Gilly, lived in another trailer nearby with their children. Chris Sr's brother Kenneth lived a short distance away. All 4 homes would become crime scenes. The Rhodens were a typical extended Appalachian family. They hunted, fished, worked on cars, and looked after one another. They were not wealthy, but they had built a life together that revolved around family bonds. April 21, 2016. The night of the murders, the massacre unfolded during the night of April 21 into the early morning of April 26, 2016. The killers moved deliberately between the 4 homes, executing their victims in what appeared to be a coordinated series of attacks. The precise timeline remains somewhat unclear, but investigators later determined that the killers used silenced firearms to shoot the Rhodens, ensuring neighbors would not be alerted by gunfire. The attacks were targeted, no one outside the family was harmed, and methodical. At Chris Sr. and Gary's trailer, both men were shot multiple times. Chris Sr. fought back, sustaining wounds that showed he had tried to defend himself. Gary was executed quickly. At Dana's trailer, Dana was killed in her bed. Her daughter Hannah, only 19, was also shot while in bed. Chris Jr., just 16, was found dead beside his mother. At Frankie and Hannah Gillies' trailer, the young couple was murdered as they slept, leaving behind their infant child, who was found alive in the bed between their bodies. At Kenneth's trailer, Kenneth was shot once in the head, execution style. In total, 8 family members were killed, each shot at close range. The killers spared the children, including Frankie and Hannah's baby, Hannah Rhoden's newborn, and another child in the house. The precision and coordination of the murders immediately suggested that this was not random violence. The killers knew exactly who they were targeting and when. Discovery of the crime scenes. The discovery of the massacre began on the morning of April 22, when Bobby Jo Manley, a sister-in-law of Dana Rhoden, came to check on the family. She first found Frankie and Hannah Gillies' bodies in their trailer, with their baby miraculously alive but covered in blood. Horrified, she fled and called for help. Sheriff's deputies arrived and quickly realized the scope of the horror. As they checked other family homes along Union Hill Road, they discovered more bodies. The scale of the killings grew with each trailer searched. Word spread quickly through Pike County. Neighbors gathered on the roads, terrified that a killer was on the loose. Parents kept children home from school, afraid of random violence. Rumors circulated of drug cartels, revenge killings, or family feuds. By the end of the day, authorities confirmed that 8 people from the same family had been murdered in 4 different locations. Ohio Governor John Kasich called it a tragedy unlike any we've seen. Initial investigation and theories from the beginning, the massacre baffled investigators. Pike County Sheriff Charles Reeder described the crime scenes as horrific. The victims were shot execution style, many in their sleep, with no signs of forced entry. The killers had moved silently, quickly, and with precision. Initial theories centered on the possibility of drug involvement. At one of the homes, investigators found evidence of marijuana grow operations. Some speculated that the killings could be tied to organized crime or drug cartels seeking to send a message. But others pointed out the personal nature of the attacks. Why spare the children if the motive was drugs? Why target only the Rhodens while leaving neighbors untouched? The precision and selectivity suggested a deep familiarity with the family, perhaps even a vendetta. Authorities launched a massive investigation. More than 100 law enforcement officers from local, state, and federal agencies descended on Pike County. They interviewed neighbors, combed through the crime scenes, and followed leads across Ohio and beyond. The shockwaves in Pike County, for Pike County residents, the murders shattered their sense of safety. The region was accustomed to small-town disputes, not calculated massacres. People began locking doors at night, carrying firearms, and watching over their shoulders. The sheer brutality of the killings and the fact that the killers remained at large for years created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Everyone wondered, who could commit such an act, and would they strike again? The funerals for the Rhoden family members drew hundreds of mourners. 8 coffins lined up in a row became the enduring image of the tragedy, a symbol of the devastation inflicted on one family and one community. A family targeted. What stood out most about the Pike County massacre was its specificity. This was not random violence. It was an execution of an entire family. The sparing of children suggested the killers had a particular grudge against the adults. Theories swirled about disputes within the family, rivalries, or past conflicts. Some pointed to custody disputes, romantic entanglements, or long-standing feuds. Others still clung to the idea of drug-related motives. But as investigators dug deeper, a clearer picture began to emerge, one that pointed not to strangers or cartels, but to another local family, one with close ties to the Rhodens themselves. Setting the stage for answers, in the months and years that followed, investigators painstakingly pieced together evidence, following threads that stretched from custody battles to surveillance recordings. It would take more than 2 years before arrests were made, but when they came, a truth stunned the community. The killers were not outsiders. They were people the Rhodens knew, trusted, even. The massacre was rooted not in cartel wars or drug rivalries, but in something more personal: family ties, custody of a child, and a belief twisted into deadly violence. But on April 27, 2016, all Pike County knew was that 8 members of one family had been murdered in their homes. and the killers were still out there. The scale of the crime, the brutality, and the mystery behind it marked the beginning of one of Ohio's most complex and haunting criminal cases. The morning after the murders of April 27, 2016, Pike County, Ohio, was buzzing with fear, speculation, and disbelief. Law enforcement knew immediately that this was no ordinary crime. 8 members of the Rhoden family were dead, each shot at close range, most in their sleep. 4 different homes had been struck, all within a few miles of each other. The killers had spared the children, suggesting a motive that was personal rather than random. This was not the work of strangers passing through. The killers had known the family's routines, their homes, and even which rooms they slept in. The question was, who hated the Rhodens enough to execute nearly the entire family in one night? Early theories in the first weeks. Investigators publicly floated the possibility of a drug connection. At 2 of the crime scenes, they discovered marijuana grow operations. Some speculated that the murders might have been the work of drug traffickers sending a message. Pike County was not immune to the drug trade, particularly marijuana cultivation and, increasingly, methamphetamine and opioids. The cartel theory dominated early headlines. The sheer scale and precision of the killings seemed almost cinematic, something people associated with organized crime. But as weeks passed, investigators began to doubt that explanation. Why would professional traffickers spare children? Why target just one family instead of wiping out an entire network? Behind the scenes, detectives were pursuing a more intimate angle. Interviews with family, friends, and neighbors pointed repeatedly to tensions between the Rhodens and another Pike County family, the Wagners. Who were the Wagners? The Wagner family was also well known in the community. At the head was George, Billy, Wagner Assur, and his wife Angela Wagner. They had 2 adult sons, George Wagner IV and Edward, Jake Wagner. Like the Rhodens, the Wagners lived in rural Pike County, worked odd jobs, and stuck close to one another. What connected the 2 families most directly was a child. Hannah Rhoden, the 19-year-old daughter of Chris and Dana Rhoden, had a 2-year-old daughter with Jake Wagner. That little girl became the focal point of a bitter custody battle, and ultimately, the motive prosecutors would argue led to murder. Jake and Hannah's relationship had been troubled. Hannah was young, independent, and not eager to marry Jake. By contrast, the Wagner family wanted Hannah firmly under their control, particularly to ensure custody of the child. When Hannah resisted, tensions escalated. According to later testimony, the Wagners were obsessed with the idea that Hannah might one day restrict their access to the little girl or involve another man in her life. That obsession grew into paranoia, and paranoia turned into planning. The Wagner obsession, Angela Wagner, the matriarch, reportedly pressured Hannah to give up full custody to Jake. Hannah refused, even telling friends she would never sign papers. That gave the Wagners total control. Prosecutors later revealed that Angela and Billy Wagner were determined to keep the child within their family at all costs. They feared losing her if Hannah moved on with someone else. For them, the solution was as horrifying as it was calculated: eliminate Hannah and anyone who could stand in their way. The Rhodens, by their closeness and protective nature, represented a barrier. To the Wagners, eliminating the Rhodens was not just about Hannah. It was about removing all opposition to Jake having custody. The scope of the investigation, while these motives would only become clear later, in the immediate aftermath, investigators cast a wide net. Hundreds of tips poured in. Detectives conducted more than 500 interviews and followed leads across multiple states. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, the Pike County Sheriff's Office, and federal agencies including the FBI and DEA all became involved. The investigation quickly became the largest in Ohio history. Still, for months, there were no arrests. No suspects were named publicly. Residents grew restless, demanding answers. Rumors swirled about cartels, motorcycle gangs, and secret family feuds. Behind closed doors, however, investigators were narrowing their focus on the Wagners. Gathering evidence against the Wagners, building a case against the Wagners, was no easy task. The Rhoden murders had been carefully planned. The killers used silencers, struck at night, and left few traces behind. But investigators were patient, slowly piecing together evidence from multiple angles. 1. Custody motive: interviews with friends and family of Hannah Rhoden revealed the depth of her conflict with Jake Wagner. Hannah confided that the Wagners wanted her to sign custody papers. She also wrote in a Facebook message that she feared for her life. This established a clear motive too. Surveillance and wiretaps investigators secretly placed the Wagners under surveillance. They monitored phone calls, intercepted messages, and even tracked their movements. Over time, they gathered evidence that the family was hiding weapons and discussing the murders indirectly. 3. Firearms evidence forensic analysis revealed that the killers had used specialized ammunition. Investigators later tied this to firearms purchased by the Wagners. At one point, the family even built their own gun parts, including silencers, which matched evidence from the crime scenes. 4. The move to Alaska in 2017. The entire Wagner family abruptly moved to Alaska. Publicly, they claimed they wanted a fresh start. To investigators, it looked like an attempt to flee scrutiny. The move only deepened suspicion. 5. Testimony and cooperation. Eventually, one of the Wagner sons, Jake, began cooperating. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Jake confessed to his role in the killings and implicated his parents and brother. His testimony would later prove crucial. The weight of silence for the Rhoden family's survivors, the years between 2016 and 2018, were filled with frustration and grief. They buried their loved ones, struggled to care for the surviving children, and lived with the constant fear that the killers were still free. Law enforcement maintained a careful silence, refusing to reveal details of the investigation publicly. While this secrecy frustrated locals, it was necessary to build an airtight case. The stakes were enormous. With 8 victims and multiple suspects, prosecutors knew the case would be scrutinized for decades to come. The breakthrough by late 2018, investigators had gathered enough evidence to move. On November 13, 2018, a Pike County grand jury indicted 4 members of the Wagner family: Billy, Angela, George IV, and Jake. Each was charged with 8 counts of aggravated murder, along with conspiracy, burglary, and tampering with evidence. The arrests stunned the community. After more than 2 years of speculation, the killers turned out not to be cartels or strangers, but neighbors. The very people connected to the Rhodens through a child. Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine, who had overseen the investigation, described the crimes as the most complex in the state's history. He emphasized the careful planning. These murders were premeditated, cold-blooded executions. Preparing for trial, the Wagners' arrests set the stage for one of the most anticipated trials in Ohio. Prosecutors prepared to prove not only that the Wagners had committed the murders, but also that their motive was rooted in custody and control. The legal process would stretch for years, with each family member facing separate proceedings. Jake would eventually plead guilty, while the others fought their charges. For the Rhoden family, the arrests brought relief but also reopened wounds. Justice was closer, but the details of what happened that night were still to come. A community changed by the time the Wagners were indicted. Pike County had already been transformed. The massacre had left an indelible mark on the community. Residents had lived for more than 2 years under the shadow of an unsolved mass killing, unsure whether the killers were still among them. Now they knew the truth. The killers had been neighbors, people they had seen in town, people who had lived just down the road. The realization deepened the community's sense of betrayal and horror, setting the stage for justice. The indictment of the Wagners was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter. Trials would reveal chilling details: how the family planned the murders, who pulled the trigger, and why the children were spared. But for investigators, the work of 2016-2018 stood as a testament to patience and determination. The case had required thousands of hours, dozens of agencies, and the most advanced forensic techniques available. In the end, it was not a cartel or an outside group. It was a family feud over a child that led to one of the worst massacres in Ohio's history. When investigators finally arrested 4 members of the Wagner family in November 2018, Pike County residents were stunned. After more than 2 years of silence, rumors, and fear, the mystery of who had slaughtered the Rhoden family was revealed. Not outsiders, not drug cartels, not random killers, but their own neighbors. people tied to the Rhodens through bloodlines and custody disputes. The arrests marked a turning point. The focus shifted from speculation to justice. Now, the task of prosecutors was to prove in court what investigators had uncovered, that the Wagners, George, Billy, Wagner III, Angela Wagner, and their sons George Wagner IV and Edward, Jacob, Wagner, had coldly plotted and executed the largest family massacre in Ohio history. The charges: each of the four Wagners faced 8 counts of aggravated murder, 1 for each of the Rhoden victims. On top of that were dozens of additional charges, including conspiracy, burglary, evidence tampering, forgery, and unlawful possession of dangerous ordnance. Prosecutors announced that they would pursue the death penalty for all 4. The case was extraordinary, a family accused of exterminating another family, driven by an obsessive custody dispute over a toddler. Ohio Attorney General Mike DeWine, who later became governor, called the murders pre-planned executions and emphasized the scale of the conspiracy. The Wagners, he explained, had spent months planning, buying supplies, and rehearsing before carrying out the killings. The plea of Edward, Jakey, Wagner, the first major breakthrough in the courtroom phase, came in April 2021. On the 5-year anniversary of the massacre, Edward Jakey Wagner pleaded guilty to all 8 counts of aggravated murder. His plea deal was stunning. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony against the rest of his family, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty against him, his parents, or his brother. Jake's guilty plea confirmed what many had long suspected, that the motive was rooted in custody of his daughter with Hannah Rhoden. He admitted in court that he had been obsessed with ensuring his daughter remained in his care and not raised in the Rhoden household. "I am guilty, Your Honor," Jake said softly as he pleaded to each charge. He admitted to pulling the trigger in some of the murders, though he insisted he had not acted alone. His chilling admissions laid bare the extent of his family's involvement. For the Rhoden family survivors, the moment was bittersweet. They finally heard one of the killers admit responsibility, but it came with the painful acknowledgement that their loved ones had been murdered not by strangers, but by someone who had once been part of their extended family. Angela Wagner's role. In September 2021, Angela Wagner, Jake's mother, also accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, and other charges. She admitted to helping plan the murders, forging custody documents, and luring the Rhodens into a false sense of security before the attack. Angela's guilty plea further reinforced the narrative prosecutors had built. This was not a spur-of-the-moment crime, but a calculated family conspiracy. She avoided the death penalty, but faced decades in prison. Billy Wagner's case. George, Billy Wagner II, the patriarch of the family, pleaded not guilty and continued to fight his charges. Prosecutors argued that Billy had been one of the ringleaders, helping to plan and carry out the killings. As of the convictions of his wife and sons, Billy's case remained one of the last unresolved pieces of the saga. The evidence against him, however, was overwhelming, including testimony from his own family members. The trial of George Wagner IV. The most high-profile trial was that of George Wagner IV, Jake's older brother. Unlike Jake and Angela, George refused to plead guilty. His trial began in August 2022 and became one of the longest and most closely watched in Ohio history. Over 4 months, jurors heard chilling testimony about the planning and execution of the massacre. Prosecutors argued that George IV had not only participated, but had been instrumental in helping carry out the crimes. Key evidence included testimony from Jake Wagner, who described in detail how the family planned the murders. Wiretaps and surveillance showing the Wagners discussing incriminating details. Firearms and ammunition tied to the killings. Custody documents forged by Angela, demonstrating the motive. The defense argued that George IV had not pulled the trigger and that he was guilty only of being part of a controlling family. But prosecutors countered that under Ohio law, his involvement in planning and carrying out the crimes made him equally responsible. In November 2022, after days of deliberation, the jury found George Wagner IV guilty on all 22 counts, including 8 counts of aggravated murder, He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentences, by the end of 2022, 3 members of the Wagner family had been convicted. Jake Wagner pleaded guilty, sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms without parole.